In neutral Ankara, a valet quietly opens a safe that was never meant to be opened. Inside are cables, conference notes, and the kind of planning documents that decide where armies land and where they don't. Night after night, those pages are photographed, sold, and rushed into encrypted traffic, straight to the heart of the Axis Foreign Ministry. On paper, it's the perfect espionage operation. Access, tradecraft, and a pipeline to Berlin. But this story doesn't hinge on whether the spy succeeds at stealing secrets. It hinges on something far rarer and far more dangerous. Whether the people receiving the secrets believe them in time. Because among these documents sits a word that will define 1944, Overlord. And the question isn't, was the leak real? The question is, why did the leak almost matter, and then, at the last moment, fail to change the war? In 1943, Turkey was a strategic fault line. Officially neutral, it sat at the crossroads of the Balkans, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the routes that fed campaigns from Italy to the Soviet South. Everyone needed Ankara. Diplomats, attaches, intelligence officers, and couriers moving papers that couldn't safely transit occupied Europe. Neutral ground created a unique pressure cooker. The war's most valuable information was concentrated inside embassies that were guarded by protocol more than by fortifications. Inside the British Embassy, security relied on habits. Keys, dispatch boxes, locked rooms, routine. And habits are exactly what espionage exploits. The man at the center of the breach was a valet, Elyesa Bazna, later known by the German code name Cicero. His position mattered more than his ideology. A valet sees what visitors do not. Where the safe is kept, when it is opened, how long the ambassador stays at dinner, which drawers are considered private, and which ones are treated casually because no one expects the help to look. Basic tradecraft, executed in the one place it works best, inside a trusted household. On the other side of town sat the German embassy, and within it an intelligence buyer with a rare advantage. He didn't need Cicero to interpret documents, only to deliver them. The handler most associated with the case was Ludwig Karl Moisisch, operating among diplomats who could move payments, arrange secure meetings, and send encrypted reports to Berlin without the friction a spy ring would face elsewhere. Cicero's pitch was simple. He could provide photographs of top-level British documents. That claim sounds common today. In 1943, it was extraordinary. Photographs meant the Germans were not getting summaries, they were getting formats, letterheads, distribution lists, and the small bureaucratic cues that help an intelligence service judge authenticity. And Cicero did not arrive with 1 or 2 stolen papers. He arrived with volume. That was the first paradox of the case. In most spy stories, volume equals credibility. Here, volume triggered suspicion. The German Foreign Ministry and intelligence consumers in Berlin worried about the obvious trap. What if this was a controlled leak, a deception feed, or a double agent used to push a manufactured narrative? That fear was not irrational. Britain was actively running deception and double agent systems by this stage of the war, and German services had already been burned. But Cicero's stream of documents kept coming, and the content was too detailed to ignore. Among the material were references to Allied diplomacy with Turkey, notes tied to major wartime conferences, and, critically, mentions of Overlord, the code name for the future cross-channel invasion. Here's the stake. If Berlin accepted the documents quickly, it could adjust force posture, shift attention to the invasion threat, and refine defenses. If Berlin dismissed the documents, it might miss the single biggest operational event of the war in the West. But the story's danger isn't only in Berlin. Because London had its own warning system, one that didn't identify Cicero by name, but told British intelligence something was wrong. British code breaking and traffic analysis could detect patterns. Sensitive information was appearing in German channels, and the timing suggested a leak. Yet knowing a leak exists is not the same as finding the leak. It is the most frustrating kind of alarm, accurate enough to terrify you, vague enough to paralyze you. So the British Embassy continued to function, receiving dispatches, drafting cables, handling classified material, while the invisible clock ran. And Cicero continued to work. But here's the twist. Cicero's success created the very doubt that neutralized him. The more he delivered, the more Berlin argued over whether it was safe to believe. Cicero's meetings followed a predictable rhythm. Documents were photographed, negatives were passed, payments were made. The operation was professional enough that later intelligence writing would describe it as a textbook exercise in tradecraft set in neutral Ankara. A textbook exercise in tradecraft set in neutral Ankara, Dorothy J. Heats, footnote to Cicero, CIA Historical Review Program, 1995. But tradecraft is only half the game. The other half is the consumer, how the recipient service evaluates, disseminates, and acts. And the consumer system in Berlin was not a single mind. It was a set of rival bureaucracies and personalities, each with incentives that discouraged risk. If Cicero was real and they ignored him, that failure would be historic. If Cicero was a deception feed and they acted on it, they could misplace resources at the decisive moment. In an environment where careers were destroyed by blame, skepticism became a form of self-defense. That skepticism had a second driver. The documents Cicero delivered contained genuine intelligence mixed with items of uncertain operational value. Some were politically sensitive. Some were time-limited. Some hinted at large future actions without giving a clean tactical blueprint. That makes the case unusually realistic. Spies don't usually steal the exact page that wins the war. They steal context, and context is hard to operationalize quickly. Meanwhile, Allied deception planning was moving into high gear. By late 1943, the overall deception concept around the invasion was forming, with sub-operations designed to convince German command the main landing would come at the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. That effort included visible signals, controlled leaks, and a larger architecture intended to shape German expectations even if fragments of truth leaked through other channels. So even a leak that included the word Overlord didn't automatically deliver a decisive advantage. It delivered a warning, one that still had to fight against a deeply entrenched German belief about where the invasion should happen. Rehook, and that's where the story tightens, because the leak wasn't just dangerous. It was confusing in exactly the wrong way. Now widen the lens back to Ankara. Neutral capitals are crowded with watchers. People notice patterns, a car parked too often, a man crossing the same street on the same day, the routine of diplomatic staff. Cicero's operation depended on staying beneath that line of pattern recognition. But intelligence work has a cruel rule. The biggest risks often arrive from within your own side. As Cicero's documents flowed, German embassy routines had to accommodate them. More encrypted traffic, more unusual urgency, more locked rooms, more pressure. That operational signature is the sort of thing a competent observer can spot even without seeing Cicero's face. And that is exactly what began to happen. By late 1943 and early 1944, Allied services received indications that a source inside the German system was referencing a spy called Cicero, operating from a British embassy. That warning did not identify the valet immediately, but it raised the kind of alarm London could not ignore. This was not a rumor about a general leak. It was a named operation, a named channel, and a specific place. What should happen next is straightforward. Once an embassy is suspected, security protocols clamp down. Safes are rekeyed, access is restricted, staff are vetted, movements are logged, and help roles are reevaluated. In a perfect world, that is the end of Cicero. But Ankara was not a perfect world, and 1944 was not a year that rewarded careful pauses. The embassy still had to function. Diplomacy still had to move. Papers still had to be read, annotated, and forwarded. So rather than a clean shutdown, the response took on the shape of wartime compromise, partial measures, internal debate, and, at least once, a deliberate attempt to catch the source by planting a document designed to flush him out. Here's the problem. If you try to trap a spy and fail, you don't just lose the spy. You teach the spy. And Cicero was learning. If embassy procedures shifted, if doors took longer to open, if a safe was suddenly harder to access, a careful valet could interpret those frictions as danger. The operation could either accelerate, steal what you can while you still can, or it could vanish before the net tightens. That brings us to the hinge point at the end of Module 1. By early 1944, multiple clocks were running at once. The invasion plan was hardening into a fixed reality. Deception efforts were becoming more elaborate and more necessary. Cicero's channel was feeding documents that were credible enough to panic Berlin but suspicious enough to delay action. And Allied counterintelligence in Ankara was finally close enough to the truth to change the embassy's routines. Which means the story is about to flip from "How did Cicero steal secrets?" to "Why did Cicero stop mattering?" Because the operation's collapse won't come from a dramatic arrest, or a shootout, or a confrontation in a hallway. It will come from a quieter, more lethal force, one human decision inside the German embassy that triggers everything else. Mini cliffhanger. In the German code room, a new figure begins to doubt the cause, doubt her colleagues, and look for a way out. And once that happens, Cicero's real danger isn't discovery by London. It's exposure from within Berlin's own house. At the exact moment the Overlord question becomes urgent. In neutral Ankara, Cicero, valet to the British ambassador, built an access-driven pipeline of photographed secrets into the German embassy. The stakes were enormous. The stream included high-level political material and references to Overlord, while Allied deception work tried to keep German attention fixed elsewhere. But Berlin hesitated, torn between the value of the documents and the fear they were controlled deception. Meanwhile, warnings that a spy called Cicero existed began to reach the Allies, and the British embassy started shifting routines and attempting countermeasures. Now the story turns on the trigger that finally destabilized the operation, an insider in the German embassy who decided the safest move was betrayal, just not to Berlin. The figure at the center of that trigger is often remembered as a supporting character, but in the Cicero case she becomes a structural force. In American intelligence accounts, she appears as a German embassy employee who sought contact with the Americans and began reporting on unusual embassy activity, especially the periodic surges of encrypted messaging tied to something very important connected to the British. That kind of reporting matters because it does what Cicero's own tradecraft avoids. It exposes patterns. Even if the defector cannot identify Cicero's face, the reporting links a timetable, certain days, heightened urgency, locked rooms, to an operation name. That is enough to move the problem from suspicion into actionable focus. Rehook. But here's the twist. Warning the British didn't automatically stop the leak. It only changed the shape of the risk. Because stopping a leak inside an embassy is not like shutting down a compromised radio set. An embassy is a living machine. You cannot freeze its functions without admitting vulnerability, and you cannot admit vulnerability without shaking diplomatic confidence. So the response often becomes incremental: improved alarms, tighter access, altered procedures, measures that reduce opportunity but don't eliminate it. And that is exactly the kind of response a skilled insider can survive. Cicero's window narrowed, but it did not slam shut. For a period, he continued to obtain and photograph documents. Yet the operational atmosphere changed. Once the embassy senses danger, routines become unpredictable. And unpredictability is the enemy of an access-based spy. Meanwhile, Berlin still faced the central problem: trust. The Cicero material was strong enough to command attention, but the fear of deception distorted how it was used. In the CIA's retrospective treatment of the case, the operation is described as one where the information was never fully used by the Nazis and where suspicion contributed to delayed action. That doesn't mean the documents were ignored. It means the intelligence did not reliably translate into operational behavior at the speed required to change the war. To understand why, connect Cicero's leak to the environment German leadership already inhabited by late 1943 and early 1944. The Germans expected an invasion in the West. By this stage, the question was not if but where, and the geography strongly suggested Pas-de-Calais. Deception planners exploited that expectation, reinforcing the most logical target with layered signals. German intelligence consumers were conditioned to distrust large gifts. A stream of pristine photograph documents looked like either a miracle or a trap. In a regime where blame was dangerous, trap often felt like the safer assumption. Even accurate intelligence can be operationally incomplete. Knowing a codename exists or that planning is advanced does not tell you the date, the weather window, the naval plan, or the exact beach selection. Without those, decisions become generalized. Strengthen the West, hold reserves, wait for confirmation. That is rarely decisive. And that leads to the core irony. Cicero may have provided truth, but the truth arrived in a form that didn't force action. Now bring the timeline forward. As Allied preparations moved towards summer 1944, the deception architecture around the invasion grew more elaborate. Fake formations, misleading signals, and a storyline designed to keep German attention locked on the wrong place even after the first troops landed in Normandy. This isn't just a clever footnote. It's the strategic container that makes Cicero's leak less lethal than it appears. Because if German command is already primed to believe Pas-de-Calais is the main threat, then a leak confirming Overlord does not necessarily break the illusion. It can even fit inside it. Yes, invasion planning is real. Yes, it's coming. And yes, it's probably where we already think it is. That is how deception survives contact with partial truth. The second force limiting Cicero's impact is bureaucratic friction in Berlin. The path from raw reporting to meaningful action had choke points, skeptical gatekeepers, rivalry between offices, and a tendency to demand absolute certainty before moving large formations. In the West, those formations were also entangled in Hitler's command style, where reserves were tightly controlled and often released late. Even perfect intelligence struggles in a decision system that is slow to adapt. So Cicero's leak became a strange weapon, sharp, real, and expensive, yet blunted by doubt. But here's the twist. While Berlin hesitated, Ankara's ground truth changed. Cicero's access began to evaporate. By early 1944, embassy security measures tightened. The atmosphere of suspicion rises in small visible ways. New alarms, new routines, more controlled handling of keys and safes. A valet who once relied on predictable gaps now has to gamble. And gambling is not what made Cicero successful. At roughly the moment Berlin still debated authenticity, Cicero began preparing to exit. The operation ended not with a dramatic capture but with a quiet departure from the embassy environment that enabled it. Later accounts note he stopped providing material and left employment, with his identity only firmly confirmed after the war. That quiet ending is one of the most important lessons of the case. Intelligence failures often don't look like failures. They look like normal life resuming. Staff transfers, routine changes, a valet finding new work, diplomats moving to new posts, files being closed. Only later does the scale of the breach become visible, when investigators reconstruct what documents were present, what could have been copied, and how much risk the war absorbed without immediate outward signs. Rehook. And now the payoff question. Did Cicero nearly unmask D-Day, or did he merely prove how hard it is to use espionage well?